A battlefield, somewhere in Europe, after the fighting has stopped. The guns have fallen quiet. The living move among the fallen, doing the grim, necessary work that follows every battle, searching the dead, friend and enemy alike, for documents, for intelligence, for anything of use. It is hard, brutal work, and the men who do it have learned to do it with a certain distance, a certain hardness, because a soldier who feels too much cannot do what war requires of him. And yet, again and again, something happened when German soldiers searched the American dead, something that the hardness could not entirely prevent. They went quiet, the talk stopped, the rough, businesslike efficiency of the work faltered, and for a moment, kneeling over a dead enemy, going through his belongings, these hardened men fell silent, because of what they found, and because of what it made them feel, and because of what it made them understand. This is the strangest and most human episode in this entire series, because it is not about a weapon, or a machine, or a system. It is about a moment of silence, a moment when the war, for just an instant, lifted, and men who were supposed to be enemies recognized, in the belongings of the dead, a shared humanity that no propaganda and no hatred and no necessity of war could entirely erase. If you were one of those German soldiers, you had learned to see the enemy, as a threat, an abstraction, a target. This is what war does, and must do, because it is very hard to kill a man you see as fully human, and so armies teach their soldiers, in 1,000 explicit and implicit ways, to see the enemy as something less than the full human being he is. You had absorbed this. You had to function. And it worked, mostly, in the heat of battle, when the enemy was a distant figure, or a muzzle flash, or a threat to be eliminated. But it did not work so well afterward, in the quiet, when you knelt over the dead enemy and went through his pockets and his pack and found there not an abstraction, not a threat, not a target, but a man, and found, in the things he carried, the undeniable evidence of his full humanity, the photographs of the people he loved, the letters from home, the small personal treasures, the ordinary human tokens of an ordinary human life. And in that moment, the abstraction collapsed, and you were confronted with the truth. The war worked so hard to hide that this dead enemy was a person, exactly as you were, loved exactly as you were loved, with a home and a family and a life, exactly as you had, and you went silent. Because there was nothing to say in the face of that recognition. Because the things you found spoke more eloquently than any words. Because you were looking, in the belongings of the dead enemy, at the mirror of your own humanity and your own mortality, and it silenced you. This is not a story about the dead. This is a forensic audit of a moment of silence, of what German soldiers found when they searched the American dead, and of why it silenced them, and of what that silence reveals about the shared human truth that persists even in the heart of war, even between enemies, even over the bodies of the fallen. Part 1. The German Calculus. To understand why the search of the American dead produced this silence, you have to understand the psychology of war, and specifically the way that armies must, of necessity, dehumanize the enemy in order to function, and the way that this dehumanization, however necessary, is always fragile, always vulnerable to the intrusion of the truth it works to suppress. War requires men to kill other men, and this is not a natural or easy thing for most human beings to do. The evidence suggests that most men have a deep, instinctive reluctance to kill other human beings whom they recognize as fully human, and that armies must work hard, through training and propaganda and the psychology of the group, to overcome this reluctance. And one of the central techniques for overcoming it is to reduce the enemy, in the soldier's mind, from a full human being to something less, a category, an abstraction, a threat, a target, a member of a hated group rather than an individual person with a face and a family and a life. This dehumanization is one of the deep engines of war, and it is present, in some form, on every side of every conflict. The German army, like every army, employed this dehumanization, and German soldiers, like all soldiers, absorbed it. They were taught to see their enemies through the lens of category and abstraction, and in the heat of battle, This worked well enough to allow them to fight and kill. The enemy in battle was the enemy, a threat to be met, a target to be hit, not a man to be mourned. But here is the crucial point in the German calculus, and it is a point about human psychology as much as about the war. The dehumanization of the enemy is always fragile, because it runs against the grain of a deeper human truth. The soldier knows, at some level, that the enemy is a man like himself, however hard he works to suppress that knowledge. And certain moments have the power to break through the dehumanization and force the suppressed truth to the surface. Moments when the enemy's full humanity becomes undeniable, when the abstraction collapses and the person is revealed. And the search of the dead was exactly such a moment. In battle, the enemy was distant, abstract, a threat. But in the quiet afterward, kneeling over the dead enemy and going through his personal belongings, the soldier was confronted with the enemy at his most intimately human, not as a threat, but as a person, revealed through the things he carried. The photographs of loved ones, the letters from home, the personal treasures. These things spoke of a full human life, a person embedded in a web of love and family and home, and they made it impossible, for a moment, to maintain the abstraction. The dead enemy became, undeniably, a man, and the recognition of that shared humanity broke through the dehumanization and silenced the soldier. There is a particular power in the belongings of the dead, and the German calculus must account for it. A living enemy can still be seen as a threat, and the abstraction maintained. But a dead enemy is no longer a threat. He is simply a dead man, and the things he carried are simply the traces of a life that is over. There is nothing to fear from him, no reason to maintain the defensive abstraction. And so the truth can come flooding in. This was a person, loved and loving, now dead, exactly as the searcher himself might be dead tomorrow. The search of the dead strips away the last justification for the dehumanization and leaves the soldier face to face with the shared humanity and the shared mortality that the war works so hard to hide. That is the German calculus. An army that, like all armies, dehumanized its enemies in order to fight them, employing the abstraction that let its soldiers kill, but an abstraction that was always fragile, always vulnerable to the truth, and that collapsed in the intimate, undeniable moment of searching the dead, when the enemy's full humanity was revealed in the things he carried, and the soldier, confronted with that humanity, fell silent. Now let us look at what, specifically, they found that produced this silence. Part 2. The American Answer. What the German soldiers found when they searched the American dead was, in a sense, the same thing they would have found searching their own dead. The universal human tokens that soldiers of every nation carry into war, but with an added dimension that made the recognition even more powerful, because the American dead carried, along with their humanity, the evidence of the abundance and the love of the nation that had sent them. Consider what they found, and why each thing had the power to silence. They found photographs, the images of wives, sweethearts, children, parents, homes. And a photograph is perhaps the single most humanizing object there is, because it shows, undeniably, the web of love in which the dead man was embedded. To look at the photograph of a dead enemy's wife and child is to be confronted with the fact that this man was loved, that his death would devastate a family, that there was a woman who would become a widow and children who would grow up without a father. The photograph makes the abstraction impossible. It forces the recognition of a full human life, now ended, and of the grief that would follow. And it silences, because there is nothing to say in the face of it. They found letters, the words from home, read and reread, carried close. And a letter, too, is profoundly humanizing, because it is the voice of home, the evidence of connection, the proof that this dead man had people who wrote to him, who missed him, who told him of home and love and the ache of separation. To find a letter on the dead enemy is to hear, faintly, the voice of a family that does not yet know their soldier is dead, that is still writing to him, still loving him, still waiting for him. And that is a silencing thing. They found personal treasures, the small tokens that people carry, the meaningful objects, the little pieces of home and identity and love, each one a sign of the individual person, the particular human being, with his own attachments and his own history and his own inner life. And they found the evidence of the American abundance we have traced throughout this series: the good equipment, the small comforts, the chocolate and the cigarettes, the material tokens of a rich nation's care for its soldiers. But even this abundance, in the context of the dead, became something human and poignant rather than something to envy. The chocolate the dead man would never eat, the comforts that had not saved him, the care of a nation that could give him everything except survival. And here is the added dimension that made the search of the American dead particularly powerful. The abundance the German found on the American dead was, on the one hand, the same evidence of material superiority we have discussed throughout this channel, the rich nation's lavish provision for its soldiers. But in the context of death, that abundance took on a different meaning. It spoke of a nation that had cared for this man, had given him everything, had loved him as a society loves its soldiers, and that abundance, that care, made his death somehow more poignant, not less. Here was a man who had been given every advantage his rich nation could provide, every comfort, every care, and he had died anyway, and all the abundance in his pack could not bring him back or comfort the family in the photograph. The very richness of the American provision underscored the poverty of death, the fact that no abundance, no care, no love could finally prevent the ending that had come to this man, as it comes to all men, and as it might come tomorrow to the German soldier kneeling over him. The German soldier, going through the belongings of the American dead, found there the universal humanity that all soldiers carry, the photographs, the letters, the love, and found it wrapped in the particular abundance of the American nation, and the combination was almost unbearably poignant. Here was a man, loved by his family and lavishly cared for by his nation, and he was dead, and all of it, the love and the abundance both, had not been enough to save him. And in that recognition, the German soldier fell silent, because he was looking at the ultimate truth that the war and all its material calculations could not touch. That beneath the abundance and the scarcity, beneath the uniforms and the nations, all men are mortal, all men are loved, and all men, in the end, die and are searched by the living, and leave behind only the tokens of the love that could not save them. The Americans gave their soldiers abundance and care beyond anything the Germans could match, and it could not save them from death. And the German soldier, finding all that abundance and all that love on the body of a dead enemy, fell silent before the truth that no nation's wealth can purchase, which is the truth of our shared mortality and our shared need to be loved. Part 3. The River of Steel. This episode connects to the themes of the channel in a different way from all the others, because it is the point where the channel's material analysis reaches its own limit and gives way to something deeper, the human truth that underlies and transcends all the material calculations. Throughout this series, we have analyzed the war in material terms, the abundance, the logistics, the systems, the industrial capacity, and decided the outcome. And this analysis is true and important. The war was, in large part, decided by these material factors, and understanding them is understanding how the war was won. But the search of the dead and the silence it produced reminds us of what all that material analysis is ultimately about and what it cannot capture. All the abundance we have traced, the food, the fuel, the equipment, the medical care, the mail, the comforts, was ultimately in the service of human beings. Loved, individual, mortal human beings who fought and suffered and died. The point of the American war machine, in the end, was to sustain and protect and, where possible, bring home these individual men. And the search of the dead is the moment where we see the human beings behind all the material analysis, not as statistics, not as the recipients of abundance, but as persons, loved and mortal, whose deaths were the real cost of the war beneath all the production figures. And the search of the dead reveals the limit of the material analysis too, because all the American abundance, all the lavish care, all the material superiority that this channel has documented, could not do the one thing that mattered most to the individual man. It could not save him from death. The dead American in the snow had been given everything his rich nation could provide, and he was dead, and the abundance in his pack was worthless to him now. The material superiority that won the war could not win the individual man his life. And in that limit we see the deepest truth, that beneath the material calculations that decide wars, there is a human reality of love, of mortality, of the individual person that no material power can finally touch. The silence of the German soldiers over the American dead is, in a sense, the moment where this channel's entire analytical framework bows before something larger than itself. We have spent this series explaining how material factors decided the war, and that explanation is true. But the search of the dead reminds us that the war was, beneath all the material factors, a human tragedy. The deaths of millions of loved, individual, mortal human beings on all sides, and that no analysis of abundance and logistics, however true, can capture the full weight of that tragedy. The silence is the acknowledgement of what the analysis cannot say. And so this episode connects to all the others by standing slightly apart from them, by being the moment where we lift our eyes from the material machinery and see the human beings it was all about, and all about killing. The river of steel, in the end, flowed toward this. The bodies of the dead, on all sides, searched by the living, revealing in the things they carried the shared humanity that the whole vast war was engaged in destroying. Part 4. The German Realization. The realization that came to the German soldiers in their silence over the American dead was not a strategic or material realization, like the others in this series. It was a human realization, and it was, in a sense, the deepest realization available to anyone in the entire war, the recognition of shared humanity across the lines of enmity. The immediate realization was the collapse of the abstraction. In the moment of searching the dead enemy and finding his humanity in the things he carried, the German soldiers carefully maintained image of the enemy as abstraction, as threat, as category, collapsed, and he was confronted with the individual person, loved, mortal, human, exactly as he was. This collapse was involuntary and often unwelcome, because it made the work of war harder, but it was also undeniable, because the evidence of the dead man's humanity was right there in his hands. The deeper realization was about the shared human condition. Kneeling over the dead enemy, the German soldier could not avoid seeing the mirror of his own situation. This dead man had been loved, as the German was loved. He had carried photographs of home, as the German did. He had been somebody's son, husband, father, as the German was. And he was dead, as the German himself might be tomorrow. The search of the dead forced the recognition not just of the enemy's humanity, but of the shared human condition that united enemy and searcher, the same love, the same home, the same mortality. And this recognition of shared humanity across the lines of enmity is, perhaps, the most profound and the most subversive realization available in war, because it undermines the very foundation of the war, which depends on seeing the enemy as other. And there was the realization about the war itself, implicit in the silence. The silence was, in a sense, a moment of mourning, not just for the individual dead man, but for the whole terrible situation that had brought two human beings, each loved, each mortal, each carrying his home in his pocket, to this. One dead in the snow, the other kneeling over him, going through his belongings, in a war that neither had made, and that was grinding up the loved sons of every nation. The silence acknowledged the tragedy of the war at its most fundamental level, the tragedy of human beings, essentially alike, essentially brothers, set against each other to kill and die by forces far larger than themselves. Not every soldier let himself feel all of this, of course. War hardens men, and many maintained the necessary distance even over the dead, and the silence passed and the work continued and the war went on. But the silence itself, wherever it fell, was the evidence that the truth had broken through, that even in the heart of war, even over the body of an enemy, the shared humanity could not be entirely suppressed, and that hardened men, confronted with the intimate humanity of the dead enemy, recognized for a moment the brother in the fallen foe. And this is the deepest German realization of the entire series, precisely because it is not German at all. It is human. The soldiers of every nation, searching the dead of every other nation, fell into the same silence, confronted the same truth, recognized the same shared humanity. The silence over the American dead was the same silence that fell over the German dead when the Americans searched them, and over the dead of every army, searched by every enemy. It was the universal human recognition, breaking through the universal machinery of war. The moment when men, despite everything, saw their own humanity in the fallen enemy and fell silent before it. The German soldier, standing up from the American dead in silence, had realized the one thing the entire war was designed to prevent him from realizing: that the enemy was his brother, loved and mortal exactly as he was, and that the war was the tragedy of brothers killing brothers, each carrying his home in his pocket to the end. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in that war, on any side, and carried home the weight of what he had seen, including perhaps the silence that fell in the presence of the dead, friend and enemy alike, I would be grateful to hear his name in the comments. The men who fought that war carried its weight for the rest of their lives, and part of that weight was the recognition, in the quiet moments, of the shared humanity of those they fought. That recognition, and the silence it produced, was one of the truest and most human things in the whole terrible conflict. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry, and the memory of the humanity that survived even in the heart of war. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. The war ends at last, and the dead of all nations are gathered and buried, and the living carry home the weight of what they saw, including the silence that fell, again and again, in the presence of the fallen. So here is the verdict, and it is different from all the others in this series, because this episode is different. The German soldiers went silent when they searched the American dead, because, in that intimate and undeniable moment, they were confronted with the full humanity of the enemy. The photographs, the letters, the personal treasures, the tokens of a loved and mortal human life, wrapped in the abundance of a nation that had cared for this man and could not save him. And that confrontation broke through the dehumanization that war requires, and forced the recognition of a shared humanity that silenced them. This is the point where the material analysis of this entire channel reaches its limit and bows before something deeper. We have explained the war in terms of abundance and logistics and systems, and that explanation is true, and it is how the war was won. But the search of the dead reminds us that beneath all the material factors, the war was a human tragedy. The deaths of millions of loved, individual, mortal human beings, and that no analysis of material superiority can capture the full weight of that tragedy. The abundance that won the war could not save the individual man from death, and the German soldier, finding all that abundance and all that love on the body of a dead enemy, fell silent before the truth that no nation's wealth can touch: our shared mortality, our shared need to be loved, our shared humanity. And the deepest verdict is this: the war was fought between nations and decided by material factors, and this channel has documented how, but it was suffered by individuals, loved, mortal, human individuals, on all sides, who carried their homes in their pockets and died far from them, and were searched by enemies who found, in the things they carried, the mirror of their own humanity. The silence that fell over the dead, on every side, was the truest human response to the war. The acknowledgement, breaking through all the machinery and all the hatred and all the necessity, that the enemy was a brother, and that the war was the tragedy of brothers killing brothers, each loved, each mortal, each somebody's own. The Americans built the abundance that won the war, but over the bodies of their dead, that abundance fell silent, along with the enemies who searched them, because in the end, beneath all the abundance and all the scarcity, beneath all the systems and all the strategies, the war came down to this: loved and mortal human beings, on all sides, dying far from home, and the shared humanity that survived, in the silence, even between enemies, even over the fallen, even in the heart of the cruelest war the world has ever known. That silence is the truest verdict of all, truer than any analysis of abundance or logistics or industrial power. It is the verdict of the human heart, recognizing itself in the fallen enemy and falling silent before the shared humanity that no war can finally destroy. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, something deeper, this time, than the usual accounting of systems and abundance, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened, in all its dimensions, including the human ones. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these, more of the machinery and the human reality both. And remember this, about the silence over the dead. Nobody makes a film about the silence, the quiet that fell over hardened men when they knelt to search the enemy dead, and found, in the things he carried, a person exactly like themselves. It is not a dramatic moment. There is no action in it, no heroism, no glory. There is only a man kneeling over another man, going quiet, because of what he has found and what it makes him understand. And yet that silence may be the truest thing in the entire war. Because in it, the whole vast machinery of dehumanization and hatred and killing failed, for a moment, before a deeper truth, the truth that the enemy was a brother, loved and mortal, carrying his home in his pocket exactly as the searcher carried his. The silence was the human heart, refusing, for just an instant, to accept the lie that the war depended on. Mostly, the war went on, and the silence passed, and the killing continued. But wherever that silence fell, over the American dead, over the German dead, over the dead of every nation, it was the evidence that something in the human heart survived even the cruelest war, the capacity to recognize, in the fallen enemy, a brother, and to mourn him, and to fall silent before the shared humanity that all the machinery of war could grind, but never quite destroy. They deserve to be remembered, the dead of every nation, and the enemies who fell silent over them, by that silence itself, which is the truest memorial there is, the human heart, recognizing its own reflection in the fallen foe, and going quiet, in sorrow, and in a kind of terrible love, over the body of a brother it had been made to kill.